Elena Hart had buried her husband nearly 3 years ago. She had stood in the rain in a black dress that cost more than her first month's rent, watched an empty casket lowered into ground that would never hold him, and cried until there was nothing left in her to cry with. So when she saw him standing across a crowded gallery in downtown Manhattan, laughing at something a stranger had said, tilting his head in that exact way he always did when he was only half listening, the champagne glass slipped from her fingers and broke against the marble floor, heads turned. Someone said her name. Elena didn't hear any of it. She was staring at a dead man in a charcoal suit, and the dead man was staring right back at her with no recognition in his eyes at all. For a moment neither of them moved. Then he turned away, said something to the woman beside him, and disappeared into the crowd as if Elena were no one at all, as if the years she had spent loving him, and the brief, blazing marriage that followed, had never happened. As if he had never loved her. Elena's fiancé, Marcus Reyes, caught her elbow before her knees gave out. "Elena. What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, though her whole body was shaking. "I thought I saw someone." She had not thought. She had known. She would have known that face anywhere, in any lifetime, under any name. To understand what had just come apart inside Elena Hart, you would have to go back to the spring when Yoon Minjun walked into her life like weather no one had forecast. She was 26 then, Yoruba, raised in a Nigerian household in New Jersey by parents who'd come from Lagos before she was born, working her way up as an interior architect in a field that hadn't always made room for her, calluses on her thumb from drafting pencils and a heart she had closed for business, on purpose, some time ago. He was 30, born and raised in Seoul before a posting brought him to New York, the kind of charming that made strangers trust him inside of 5 minutes. He said he ran an import consultancy, a phrase so vague that Elena would later understand it had been built to mean nothing at all. They met at a client dinner neither of them wanted to attend. He spilled wine on her portfolio and, instead of apologizing, told her the stain improved the floor plan. She laughed before she meant to. 3 months later he was memorizing how she took her coffee, and arguing, with total seriousness, that her mother's egusi could not possibly be better than his mother's kimchi jjigae, though he made her cook it for him twice before he'd admit he might be wrong. 8 months later he proposed on a rooftop in Brooklyn with the city lit gold behind him, and Elena, who had never believed in the version of love that arrives without warning, said yes before he finished the question. They married the following spring. Elena's mother wanted her in Oso Oak and Gelly, surrounded by aunties who would dance money into the folds of her dress before the night was through. Minjun's parents, flying in from Seoul, wanted a piebeek the following morning, just family, dates and chestnuts tossed into Elena's skirt for the children she and Minjun would one day have. So they had both. Minjun danced badly and on purpose at the reception, just to make her laugh at their own wedding, and later, when the guests had gone, he held her face in both hands and told her that whatever came next, she was the only home he had ever wanted. She would turn that sentence over for years after. Whatever came next, as if some part of him had already known, they honeymooned on the Massachusetts coast, in a town of gray shingled houses and a lighthouse that blinked red through the fog. On their 4th night there, Minjun said he couldn't sleep and wanted to walk along the water. Elena, warm and already half asleep, told him to bring back coffee. She woke to an empty bed. Minjun had never returned. The search lasted 11 days. The Coast Guard found his jacket snagged on rocks half a mile down the shore, and a capsized rental kayak that made no sense at all, since Minjun had never once mentioned wanting to kayak. There was no body. There were, in the flat clinical language of the report, no recoverable remains. For 3 days Elena herself became a subject of quiet suspicion, the widow who had, after all, been the last one to see him, until a local investigator named Detective Foster cleared her, gently, and told her that sometimes the ocean simply took people and gave nothing back. Elena buried an empty casket and spent the following year in Boston learning how to be a widow at 27. Her mother flew up twice that year just to sit with her in a quiet apartment and cook, because there wasn't much else either of them knew how to do with grief that size. Elena stopped answering the life insurance investigator, who kept implying, without ever quite saying it, that a body no one finds is a claim that's hard to pay. She stopped sleeping on Minjun's side of the bed, then stopped sleeping in the bed at all, and somewhere in that year she stopped grieving in the loud way and started grieving in the way that looks, from the outside, almost like healing that it was her best friend, Sophia, who finally talked her into leaving Boston once the year had turned. "You're not getting better here," Sophia told her. "You're just haunting the place it happened." So Elena took a position at a design firm in Manhattan, in a city that had never known Yoon Minjun, and spent the better part of a year rebuilding something that felt like a life before she let anyone new into it. She met Marcus at a rooftop fundraiser for a housing nonprofit whose board he sat on. He was easy where Minjun had been electric, steady where Minjun had been a small, beautiful storm. He was, from the beginning, a man interested in the shape of her past. He asked, early and often, whether she had truly finished grieving, whether there was anyone she still thought about, whether she believed she could love completely a second time, questions she mistook, then, for the tenderness of a man who wanted to understand her, rather than a man conducting an inventory. 18 months into their relationship, he proposed on a quiet Tuesday, no rooftop, no fanfare. Just the two of them on her couch, and Elena said yes because it felt safe, and because some tired, grieving part of her had decided that safe was the only kind of love she had any right to want. Marcus had brought her, over those 18 months, into a wider circle than she'd ever traveled in before, gallery openings, benefit dinners, the private view of one collection after another, always with the same easy explanation: these were his clients, his patrons, people it was good for both of them to know. Elena never thought to ask why one particular gallery, funded quietly by a philanthropist named Victor Kane, kept appearing on their calendar more often than the others. She had no reason to, and then, for months before her second wedding, she walked into that gallery on Marcus's arm and watched a dead man drink champagne. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay beside Marcus, replaying the tilt of that stranger's head, trying to talk herself out of what she already knew. Grief plays tricks, she told herself. It builds ghosts out of strangers with the right jaw. But by morning, before she'd finished her coffee, she was scrolling through the gallery's guest photos from the night before, searching face after face until she found him in the background of someone else's post, untagged, unnamed, a stranger to anyone who didn't already know that jaw, that tilt of the head, but pinned to his lapel, small and silver, was a guest badge, and printed across it, blurred but legible when she enlarged the image until the pixels came apart, was a company logo, a stylized wave over the words Courland Maritime, one of the gallery's listed event partners. It took her 2 more hours to find an address in Lower Manhattan, a modest logistics office 2 blocks from where she'd stood dropping a champagne glass the night before. She told no one, not Sophia, and certainly not Marcus. She lied to her fiancé about a work trip, took 3 personal days, and did something she never thought herself capable of. She began, quietly and methodically, hunting a ghost whose name she still didn't know. She stood across the street from the Courland Maritime office for 40 minutes on a Thursday afternoon before she saw him come out, laughing at his phone, and any last hope that she'd been wrong collapsed. It was him. The same scar through his left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident he'd once described to her in loving, ridiculous detail. The same restless check of the street before he crossed it, like a man who had spent his whole life being followed, even in years when he hadn't been. She followed him 2 blocks before her nerve caught up with her legs, and she said his name, low, right there on the sidewalk. Minjun. He went still. For a long moment he didn't turn, and Elena thought, absurdly, that he might simply keep walking, might vanish around the corner and leave her with nothing but her own certainty to carry. But then he turned, and up close, without the noise of the gallery between them, she watched the composed surface of his face come apart. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, roughened at the edges, but it was his. "Elena, walk away right now, and forget you ever saw me. I buried you." Her own voice cracked, and it embarrassed her. "I stood at a funeral for a body that was never even there, and you're telling me to walk away? That's not my name anymore. Don't." The word came out sharper than she meant it to. "Don't stand there and pretend after everything you took from me." He looked around them then, scanning the street with the same wariness she'd noticed from across the road, and something in that motion, controlled, professional, frightened, told her this was not a man who had simply run from a marriage he regretted. This was a man still running from something else. "Not here," he said finally. There's a coffee place 2 streets down. Give me 15 minutes. Please. He was 40 minutes late, and Elena spent every one of them convinced he wasn't coming at all. But he came, sliding into the booth across from her with his collar turned up and his eyes still doing that restless sweep of the room. What he told her over lukewarm coffee took the rest of that year to fully believe, let alone forgive. Yoon Minjun, he explained, had never simply run an import consultancy. For 6 years before he met Elena, he had been a federal agent, working undercover for a joint task force investigating money laundering routed through legitimate shipping and art importation businesses, dirty money moved through paintings and container ships instead of duffel bags of cash. The organization he'd spent years embedding himself inside belonged to a man named Victor Kane, a collector and philanthropist whose public face hid a network that stretched from art auctions to offshore accounts to, on occasion, enforcement considerably more violent than art or shipping usually required. Meeting Elena had never been part of any assignment. That, at least, he needed her to believe, and something in the pleading way he said it made her want to. He had fallen for her the way anyone falls for anyone, inconveniently, completely, and for a while he'd let himself believe he could hold on to both at once, the private life he had built with her, and the undercover life that could destroy it. Their wedding, their honeymoon, none of it had been performance, but 3 days before that walk on the beach, Minjun's handler had warned him his cover was slipping. Kane's people had begun asking questions about the consultancy's finances that Minjun couldn't cleanly answer. 2 days after that, a fellow operative working an adjacent piece of the investigation was found dead in a manner staged to look accidental, but which everyone on the task force understood as a message. His handler, a federal agent Minjun called Ruiz, made the call that night. Minjun's cover was blown. If Kane's people suspected he was an informant, they would not only come for him, they would come for the woman he'd just married, as leverage, or worse, as a lesson. The fastest way to make Elena safe was to make Minjun disappear so completely that no one, including Elena herself, would ever think to look for him again. In the hours before dawn, while the town still slept, task force contacts planted the jacket on the rocks and staged the kayaks overturning along a current that would carry any real evidence out past where local divers could reach. There would be no body to recover because there was never meant to be one to find, only enough wreckage to make the story believable, and a grieving widow whose grief would read, to anyone watching, as entirely real. Because it would be. His own identity, he told her, had been administratively suspended that same week. He was given a new name, Julian Mercer, and quietly pulled from ordinary fieldwork. He wasn't free, and had never been free, to walk back into his old life or hers. The case against Kane stayed open on paper and stalled in practice, and Minjun spent 2 years in a kind of professional limbo, assisting Ruiz in a limited, unofficial capacity whenever the task force needed someone who could still move through the shipping world without raising questions. That was, in fact, the reason he'd been at the gallery at all. An intermediary with ties to Kane's network had asked, through a channel Minjun still maintained as Julian Mercer, for a brief meeting on neutral ground. He was meant to arrive, speak to one person for a few minutes, and leave before anyone thought to look at him twice. The guest list had changed at the last minute, in a way no one had flagged to him in time. "You let me bury you," Elena said, when he finished, "to protect me. I let you bury me because it was the only way to guarantee they'd stop watching you the second they stopped watching me," Minjun said. "I've replayed that night more times than I can count, and there was never a version where I got to say goodbye." She wanted, badly, to believe that grief could excuse 2 years of silence, and some furious, exhausted part of her wanted to throw the coffee in his face and never think about Julian Mercer again. Instead she asked the only question that mattered. "Why now? Why let me see you at all?" "I didn't mean to," he said, and for the first time something crossed his face that was distinct from guilt, fear, plain and unhidden. "I was supposed to be in and out of that room in 10 minutes. You weren't supposed to be there." "I was there with my fiancé," Elena said, and watched his jaw tighten on the word. "Who is he?" "Marcus. Marcus Reyes." Minjun went completely still. "Reyes," he repeated. "What does his family do?" "I don't know." "Why does that matter?" "It's probably nothing," Minjun said, too fast, reaching for his coffee instead of her eyes. It's a common enough name. Forget I asked. But Elena had spent years learning every register of Minjun's voice, and she knew a lie the moment it left his mouth. Even wearing another man's name, she went home and lay perfectly still beside Marcus, cataloging him like a stranger for the first time in 18 months, the easy way he always seemed to know which room she was in without being told, the business trips that never quite matched the emails he sometimes left open on his laptop, the single early night, months into their relationship, when she'd mentioned Minjun's name and Marcus's face had flickered into something she had mistaken, back then, for a living man's discomfort around a dead one, the way he'd once picked up her phone to charge it and taken a beat too long before handing it back. Over the following 2 weeks Elena became someone she barely recognized, a woman who checked her fiancé's phone while he showered, who noticed the same car idling too long outside her building on 2 separate mornings, who met Minjun 3 more times in increasingly cautious conversations in parks and back booth diners, assembling a picture that made less sense the more of it she sawed. It was Sophia who finally cracked the piece Elena couldn't reach alone. Sophia worked in financial compliance at a mid-size bank, the kind of job that had taught her exactly where public records ended and real answers began, and when Elena finally told her everything, Sophia did what grief and fear had kept Elena from doing. She pulled Marcus's professional history past the polished bio on his firm's site and found a 5-year gap between his business degree and his current position that no one had ever bothered to explain. A contact of hers in investigative reporting pointed her toward an old court filing, half forgotten in an archive, naming a small shipping firm once tied to Victor Kane's network, a firm where Reyes had served, a generation back, as a listed signatory. Elena sat on her bathroom floor with her phone in her lap and was sick. She didn't confront Marcus that night, or the next. She told Minjun instead, meeting him in the corner of a laundromat at 11 at night because he swore it was the one kind of place no one thought to watch. His reaction told her everything the documents hadn't. He went quiet, then pale, then took both her hands and told her, in a voice that seemed to cost him everything he had, that she needed to listen and do exactly what he said. Reyes isn't a coincidence, he told her. His family's had ties to Kane's shipping and financial network for longer than my investigation existed, legitimate cover, going back a generation. That name still carries weight in Kane's world. Marcus isn't wearing an alias, Elena. Reyes is his real name. That's why Kane trusts him without question. And if Marcus was placed near you on purpose, the timing fits, 18 months, right around when my file went cold, he wasn't sent to hurt you outright. He was sent to watch you, patiently, on the theory that if I were still alive, I'd eventually be unable to stay away from you. You weren't a target, Elena. You were the door left open in case I ever tried to walk back through it. Then I go to the police. Tonight. Kane owns people inside 3 departments. That's not me being dramatic, that's 6 years of evidence. The only people I trust are on the task force, and even that list got shorter after what happened to my colleague. I need to call Ruiz. I need you to go home, act normal, and give me 48 hours. Marcus is going to know something's wrong. He's not stupid. I know, Minjun said, and something grim in his face frightened her more than anything he'd told her all night. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. He was right to be. 2 nights later Elena came home to find her apartment door unlocked, though she was certain she'd locked it, and the contents of her desk very slightly disturbed, not ransacked, not obviously searched, but wrong in the specific way only someone who lived beside you every day would notice. She stood in her own living room with her heart slamming and understood, with total clarity, that whoever had been there had wanted her to know it. Marcus came home 20 minutes later, kissed her forehead, and asked why she looked so pale, and Elena, for the first time in her adult life, was afraid of the man standing in her kitchen. She called Minjun from the bathroom with the shower running to cover her voice. He picked up on the first ring. Ruiz has a plan, he said, low and fast. Kane holds a private auction once a year, art sold at inflated prices to shell buyers, the whole thing built to move money through a room full of receipts. It's in 4 days, at a warehouse gallery downtown. It's the one night Kane vets every guest personally, which means it's the one night the task force has never been able to get anyone real inside. Except this year, because of you, he'll have a guest he already trusts completely. Marcus. Marcus. Which means you have an invitation too, as his fiancé. Kane still keeps a physical ledger, old-fashioned, untraceable digitally, kept in a wall safe in his office during the auction, because a man like that trusts paper more than servers. If you can get close enough to that room, we get 6 years of work finished in one night, the ledger, the buyers, the routes. Elena, I would never ask this if there were another way, and if you say no, I'll find one. But I need you to understand what it would mean. Elena thought of the empty casket. Of years spent grieving a man who'd been alive the whole time, running from people she hadn't known existed. Of Marcus's calm, familiar hands, and his family's name buried inside an old court filing tied to one of Kane's shipping companies. I'll do it, she said. But you're the one who walks me out of that building. Not Ruiz. Not some agent I've never met. You. You owe me that. Elena, you've owed me a goodbye for years, Minjun. This time you're going to actually show up for it. Ruiz, for his part, temporarily restored Minjun to active operational status for the auction alone. He would be authorized, armed, and connected to the entry team, but under strict order to stay in the surveillance van unless Elena triggered the emergency signal or the supervising agent called the team to move. They built the rest of the operation carefully over the days that followed. The device Elena would wear had 2 parts, a live transmitter that would send every word to the van 2 blocks away, and a second, encrypted recorder sewn into the lining of her dress that would keep working locally even if the signal failed. An agent posing as catering staff would shadow the nearest corridor the moment Elena moved toward Kane's office, never more than 1 locked door away. If she needed to abort before any of that, she was to touch her earring twice, a small, ordinary gesture, the kind a nervous bride-to-be might make a dozen times in one evening without anyone thinking twice about it. The warehouse gallery, on the night of the auction, glittered with the particular expensive hush of people who never had to think about money in any way that mattered. Elena stood at Marcus's side in a dress Sophia had helped her choose, one with enough structure in the bodice to hide both devices. Her hands did not shake, though every part of her wanted them to. She had spent 3 days becoming this version of herself, calm, adoring, exactly the fiancé Marcus believed he had. She found Victor Kane at the center of the room easily, a silver-haired man with a grandfatherly laugh who was, Minjun had told her, tied directly to at least 4 deaths the task force could prove and an unknown number they couldn't. He kissed her hand when Marcus introduced her, told her she was even lovelier than promised, and Elena smiled and thanked him and hated how easily the smile came. The plan required her to get close enough to Kane's private office, where the ledger sat behind a wall safe during the auction. Marcus, predictably, was the one who could get her back there, since Kane trusted him without question. All Elena had to do was ask, sweetly, for somewhere quiet to take a call, and let Marcus walk her past the one door that mattered. That IT worked exactly as planned, right up until the office door shut behind them and the live signal dropped into flat, sudden dead air, the steel lining of the wall swallowing the transmission hole, though neither Elena nor the van 2 blocks away would understand that until later. The recorder in her dress kept running. She had no way to know it. Marcus closed the door and said, in a voice she had never once heard from him in 18 months, "You should have stayed home tonight, Elena." She turned, and the calm, steady man she'd nearly married was gone. "I know about the wire," he said. "I've known since you came out of the bathroom 4 hours ago with your hands shaking. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Elena's mouth went dry. She lifted one hand to her earring, touched it once, then again. Marcus watched the gesture and gave a faint, humorless smile. "No one can hear you in this room." "Marcus, it was never supposed to be like this." For 1 second something close to regret crossed his face. "You were supposed to be away to watch the door in case he ever came back." "I wasn't supposed to." He stopped himself, jaw tight. "Where is he?" "Tonight. Tell me and you walk out of this building." "For 18 months, she said instead, you gave me every reason to trust you." "Was any of it real?" Something in his face flinched, and for a moment he looked less like a man cornering her and more like a man cornering himself. Does it matter now? It matters to me. For 18 months I gave you patience, safety, everything you said you wanted, he said, low. Don't waste what's left of it. She understood, in the silence that followed, that no one outside that door knew anything was wrong, and that whatever happened next would happen because of what she did in the next minute, not because anyone was coming to save her. So she kept him talking. She asked whether Kane had put him there from the beginning, whether he'd known her name before the fundraiser or only after. She watched something in him want to answer honestly, even now, and used every second it bought her. Marcus crossed to the open safe, pulled out the ledger, and turned toward the shredder built into the credenza behind Kane's desk. Elena moved before she'd decided to, stepping between him and the machine, knocking a glass sculpture off the desk's edge as she did. It hit the floor and broke apart with a sound sharp enough to carry through a closed door. In the corridor outside, the agent in a caterer's jacket, who had already noticed the silence where there should have been chatter, heard it and moved. The warning went up the chain. In 4 words. Minjun, sitting in the van with nothing but dead air for the last 90 seconds, didn't wait for the order to reach him in full. He was out of the van and through 2 more doors before Ruiz had finished telling the team to move. The office door opened, and Minjun stepped through it with his weapon raised and controlled, agents fanning out behind him, Ruiz's badge already out. Federal agents. On the ground. Now. Marcus's hand moved toward the ledger instead of toward the floor, and for one terrible second it looked as though he might try to run with it or ruin it rather than surrender it. Elena reached past him and slid it across the desk, out of his hands, while 2 agents took him to the ground and a third called the room clear. Only then, weapon lowered, holstered, the room confirmed secure, did Minjun cross to her. You're okay, he said, and only then let himself reach for her. You're okay. I've got you. The months that followed untangled slowly, the way these things do once the dramatic part ends and the paperwork begins. The recorder Elena had carried into that office preserved everything the live wire had missed, and once investigators recovered it, Marcus's own words became part of the evidence against him. Combined with the ledger, it was enough to secure warrants that led to raids on 2 of Kane's shell operations within weeks, frozen accounts, and testimony from lower-level members eager to trade information for shorter sentences. It took the better part of a year, additional warrants, and a great deal of forensic accounting before Victor Kane himself was formally charged, but the case that had stalled for 6 years finally moved. Marcus took a plea deal that would keep him in prison for close to 2 decades. Whatever part of him had ever cared for Elena, if any of it had been real at all, was something she eventually stopped trying to locate in the wreckage. Minjun's status as an operative was formally closed out and his own name quietly restored on every document that mattered, though the man who'd walked out of that warehouse held Elena's hand like Julian Mercer and Yoon Minjun had finally, permanently, become the same person. It took Elena a long time to forgive him, and longer still to trust the ground under her own life again. Some nights she woke reaching for proof he was still there, still real, not some story she'd told herself to survive her own grief. Other nights she woke angry in a way she hadn't let herself be yet, furious that years of her life had been spent grieving a man who was breathing the entire time, furious that the choice to live that way had never once been hers to make. You don't get to keep saying you had no choice, she told him, one night, months in, when the anger finally had somewhere to go. Maybe you didn't. But I paid for that decision every day for years, and you don't get to explain that away just because it kept me alive. Minjun didn't argue. You're right, he said. It saved your life. It still cost you something I can't give back. I'm not going to keep telling you it was the only way, like that makes the time disappear. It doesn't. I just get to be sorry, and stay, and try to earn something better than sorry. She started seeing a therapist that spring, someone Sophia had found for her, and for the first few months she went alone. Minjun went through his own version of it, debriefings, evaluations, the slow bureaucratic work of becoming a person on paper again, and neither of them rushed the other. His mother, calling from Seoul once she finally learned the truth, wept on the phone the way Elena's own mother had wept 2 weddings ago, and it took her longer than Elena expected to forgive her son for what he'd let them all believe. Elena's mother, for her part, held her daughter through it the way she always had, cooking through the worst of the anger because that was the only language she'd ever fully trusted. When Elena finally let Minjun back into her life in full, she did it with conditions spoken plainly out loud. No more decisions made for her safety without her in the room. No more silence dressed up as protection. If something threatened them again, they faced it together or not at all. They rebuilt trust in ordinary ways rather than dramatic ones. Grocery lists, late apartment keys texted the second he was 5 minutes behind, a habit he built of telling her where he'd be even when nothing was wrong, just so the telling itself became normal again. They didn't rush back into a wedding. Elena had learned, the hard way, what it cost to build a life on top of even a well-intentioned lie, and she wanted, this time, to build something slower, something tested, but on a quiet evening a year later, on a different rooftop in a different part of the city, with no gold lights and no grand proposal, Minjun simply took her hand and told her he'd already lost her once to a lie he told to keep her safe, and he had no intention of losing her again to anything, least of all his own silence. Elena said yes for the second time in her life, to the same man wearing his own name again. And when he looked at her this time, there was nothing of the stranger left in his eyes at all.